Coming up on this episode of Common Denominator.
So there are the business people and there are the journalists. And in every single newsroom in the country, those two things have to collide as best as they possibly can, where you can try to meet that utopian hope of what journalism is, but you also need to make a profit so you can keep your news outlet open.
This is Common Denominator, straight-up conversations with Moshe Popak. Relying on critical thinking and open-spirited debate, we invite you to find common ground on everyday issues and encourage you to be bold, to be optimistic, and to take action. To learn more, head to moshepopak.com, and we'd be so grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to the show. Now, here's your host, Moshe Popak.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. This week, finding common ground on how we feel about and what we should take from the media. According to a Gallup poll from October of 2021, only 36% of Americans have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media, which is the second lowest on record, and 34% of Americans have no trust at all. So, why is this and how can it be fixed? My guest is J.P. Hervis, an award-winning broadcast journalist who spent 13 years investigating, reporting, and writing headlining stories. He's been a morning anchor and has reported for CNN and Fox News. Now, JP is the founder and operator of Brandstory Communications, a South Florida-based public relations firm. He'll help us better understand what goes on in a newsroom and how that impacts what you see and hear. JP, welcome to the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Moshe.
So you just heard these amazing stats. Why do you think public trust of the media is so low at this point?
I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, I think that there has been a longstanding utopian feeling of what the news media should be, of this absolute walking of the fence, of being fair, being unbalanced, and all of that. And if you think about it, the news media is full of people, and people by their very nature are probably not going to be able to walk the fence. Now, I can tell you personally, you get rid of as much as you possibly can when you're writing a story, if you're doing journalism in the way that you're supposed to. Right. But I can see in many places how people may not be able to, how journalists may not be able to. So I think that the first thing the public needs to do is get rid of this feeling of utopian news media, that's the way it's supposed to be. Once I think that you accept the fact that it may lean a little bit in best case scenarios one way or lean a little bit that way, your expectation of it can be totally different. The second thing is I think that the public needs to better educate itself as to the news media. And I think we can both agree, Moshe, that a general belief about an entire profession or entire religion or entire group of people, just a general belief, it's unbiased, it's untrustworthy. This group of people is not a fair place to start, because some of my very best friends and people I work closely with are all journalists, and they believe in it. They believe in journalism being able to uncover the truth. They believe that journalism can hold the feet to the fire of the people in power. They believe journalism can help make a difference. There's a lot of those, and it's most of those, and that's what we shoot for as journalists. But you need to, and this would be my third point, what you need to tie into the fact is, and you can appreciate this as a successful businessman, it is a business.
Right.
It is a business.
Right.
And there are only few media companies left in both local and national television. And we all know the less amount of groups that own something, the bigger problems you have. You're getting closer and closer to that monopoly word. So a business is looking to make money. So there are the business people and there are the journalists. And in every single newsroom in the country, those two things have to collide as best as they possibly can, where you can try to meet that utopian hope of what journalism is, but you also need to make a profit so you can keep your news outlet open.
Right. So I love that you said about expectation management. In other words, that we as people should not be lazy. We want to, I think about it, what's actually really happening, right? At the end of the day, we're exhausted, long day. We want to just sit in front of the TV, turn on the news and, want to be fed information. It could be Tucker Carlson on Fox News. It could be on CNN. But at the end of the day, to your point, these people, it's their opinion of something. I always say there's this side, there's that side, and there's the truth, right? We can go on what I think is go on the internet, which again is free, right? And then find articles this way, find articles that way, and then come up with your own opinion, right?
Right. It's the work that we need to do as the general public. And you bring a good point with Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow. I want to hold the feet to the fire of the news business. And the news business, the biggest problem it's really had, and the reason it finds itself at the numbers that you're at right now, besides what the public needs to do, is that the news business hasn't changed. It needs to change. It needs to develop. It needs to develop to new generations, the Gen Xers and the Gen Yers and the people that are coming up now, and what their expectations of what they want in news mean. It needs to develop in how it tells its stories. There's a lot of conversation in the news business now about how the bleeds it leads that has impacted the news business for 35 years is not really the way people want to consume. But the general public and the news media have a role to play when you're talking about things like a Tucker Carlson and a Rachel Maddow. That's not news. Right. That's commentary. Within commentary, you can have facts, but as a viewer, you have to study enough and be comfortable enough to know I'm watching Tucker Carlson, who has a slanted view, and he might have some very true facts that are inarguable, but it still comes with a slant. Same thing with Rachel Maddow, not picking sides. The interesting thing, and this is something that a lot of people may not realize, is a Pew Research study, a recent Pew Research study showed that local television news media is the most trusted. It's still less than 50%. Right. Local television news media is still the most watched, even though it's under 50% collectively. So much like a political campaign, and you have to think that the news media, if it wants to stay alive in the truest way, it almost has to run for office and get public trust again. It's grassroots. A lot of the change is going to have to start in how the local press operates, and then it'll work its way, hopefully, up.
Yeah, it seems,
and that's going to be important.
I was just thinking, it seems to your other point, right? Someone's like this big behemoth, like too big to fail, like the national media, right? So it's all about, to the bottom line, the profit, right? Compared to local, they're I guess a little more struggling or trying to make it happen, and they're not as biased, if you wanna call it that, or driven to just get that emotion from their audience.
Right, exactly. And that's why there's a little bit more room to work in local news media. The problem with local news media is it's not doing it fast enough. Scripps, which is one of the largest television or media ownership companies in the country. They have, I think, 60 television stations in 42 markets. They're actually doing something interesting right now. And I read this in an article from The Atlantic. They are actually going to a lot of communities, and they're knocking on the doors of people under the age of 50, over the age of 30. And they're asking them, what do they want to see more? Why are you not watching local news? And a lot of what this article from The Atlantic is reporting is that the younger audiences now, they're really speaking to not wanting it bleeds, it leads, not wanting so much crime, all these things that generated ratings for a long time. They want to see longer form stories, which as a reporter, we used to, in the local news media, a TV reporter, I'd get a minute, 30, minute 45 to tell a story. If I asked for 4 minutes, it would be like me asking for like the keys to life from my boss, right? But the audience is changing, and the news media needs to try to change with it. And I have to credit Scripps for wanting to do that. And when it comes to the cable companies, here's a good example of the business profit margin. When CNN came out as the first cable news company, it had reporters all around the world. It could just move to coverage everywhere. Where they scaled down the number of reporters it had stationed all over the world. And they changed it for what? Commentary talking heads. Why? Less costly. Right. It's less costly to have somebody sitting next to an anchor on a desk in Atlanta or in New York or in DC than it is to pay for multiple crews working out of a Tel Aviv a Tel Aviv market that reports back. So we need to get back into the field, and that's where the investment should be, and I think is now for some of the 24-hour cable news networks.
Do you think that, in general, there is a trying, even though there's a, I guess, subconscious bias, but do you feel that the journalists that are out there do try genuinely to try to get it right? Do you feel that they try to get the story right?
Yeah, especially in what I do now with my company, Brandstory Communications, where companies hire us to earn media for them. It's a real joy for me as a news person because I get to talk to stations in the smallest markets in the country to the largest markets in the country. And I get to mostly deal with the people in the newsroom and the reporters in the field. When I talk to these folks, it's no different from when my 13 years as a reporter in the field. They're just trying to get the story. They're trying to get the content that they need, but they're covering what they're being directed to cover in most cases. So it goes back to a management level, and management of news does have to respond to the business side of a news station. So that's the dynamic that somehow has to change. You have to have business management that's willing to let their local news out have a metamorphosis. But to answer your question, I absolutely believe that the vast majority of journalists out there, when they leave college and they want to be a reporter, they don't want to be a reporter because they want to go out there and tell a biased story. They want to go out there because they want to make a difference, be part of a community, be a part of breaking news, be a part of history, all the reasons why a lot of us got into journalism in the first place.
And just from your experience, when do you think that media got it wrong, and when do you think they got it right?
That's a great question. The Bleeds It Leads really started in the mid 80s, and it started locally, in local news. And when the larger networks saw, especially the 24 hours, saw that was working, that metamorphosis happened for them locally as well. So it was a lot of fast-paced, simple, what can we get, what's sensationalistic? And it turned into a word that I talk to my clients about all the time. It's turned into infotainment. They know to be able to keep your attention, there's got to be a lot of almost light for the fireflies, right? Or the lighting bugs, to be able to keep your attention. Now, and it goes back to what I was referring to before, some of the studies are showing that people don't want that as much. They do want well-told, in-depth stories that actually impact their community or impact the world in some type of way. Ratings went way up in COVID.
Right.
And it's not just because people were home, because people were scared. This was something that was affecting everybody, and that was an opportunity to help everybody. So I think it worked from the bottom, if you will, local news up to cable.
Yeah, but
so it's going to take a bottom-up approach, I think, in local news to then change that, because everybody who's your local news reporter now is your next CNN or Fox News anchor in the future.
I wasn't a big fan of, every time you mentioned during COVID, obviously, right, you got to get the emotion, right? You get someone's emotion, and then that's what it is. But every time, whether it was Fox or CNN, turning on the TV, and there's this red box, right? Number of deaths, number of hospitalizations for months and months. Right in the beginning, I'm like, I can't watch this. I can't lead my life over fear. I know that that's the behavior of the people, to your point, but that was, that really didn't work. And I had this conversation. Now we're in the crux of Russia and Ukraine with I'd say a pretty smart family member of mine. And I said, I just came across a different viewpoint. They're, a daily or weekly watcher of just Fox News. And I said, this is something interesting. As a critical thinking person, I said, can I send you this information? And they literally like, no, don't send it to me. And it was so eye-opening for me to hear that. The way I see and the way I want to be as, I guess, radically open-minded as can be, search for truth, because I think that that's where people want to go. Authenticity, the truth. I would think so.
Look at it in going back to that original stat and the trust factor. Look at it like any relationship. In a relationship of two parties, in this case, the general public and the news media, it's a breakdown on both sides. it's never usually one person's fault. Somebody can change or adjust themselves somehow to make the relationship better. And I think that's the case. Once again, I think the public needs to be more educated and open-minded about what the role of the news media is, and educated as to the difference between commentary and news coverage. They're totally different branches on the same tree of news media. And then the news media needs to have a continue its effort, or some outlets have an effort of a metamorphosis of trying to get away from bleeds it leads, trying to tell more in-depth stories, try to do things that impact the community. So both sides. And is it going to happen? I don't know. I hope so. As a traditionalist and somebody who loves what journalism and the news media can stand for and has in the history of this country, I hope it happens. But it's going to have to be both sides. And another way, by the way, the public plays into this is, the news media a lot of time over the years has been reported, just like any other business, they take surveys of what it is their customer wants. If it's a Mexican restaurant, they serve two types of tacos, and one taco is getting ordered a lot. Guess which taco is going to be on sale more, and then you get rid of the other one. So if they've been doing surveys and study groups over the years of people who would pay attention to news more with bleeds it leads, then that's what they're feeding. When CNN's ratings go through the roof every time they say Trump, CNN's going to do everything they possibly can that deals with Trump. And then the same is true for Fox. The same is true for OWN and some of these other now more right-leaning news outlets. They know what they're trying to align themselves with because they see the ratings. And like any other business too, they're also reading clicks. Right. What's getting clicked on our website more? Okay, so that's the kind of story we need to cover. If in some weird, insensitive world, nobody was clicking or ratings weren't jumping on Russia, Ukraine, you wouldn't see half the coverage that you're seeing now. You wouldn't, because they read those, it's live action. They see those numbers while they're happening, especially as streaming networks pick up more. They're seeing those numbers as they happen. They read, they see how many times on CNN.com somebody goes, or the New York Times sees which article gets clicked more than others. And they'll try to keep doing that story over and over and over again. And that's where they drive the depth. They drive the depth based on audience reactions. The audience either needs to react to something different, or the news media needs to come up with a new way on evaluating what should and shouldn't be a good story.
Well, I think I'm obviously going to the name of the podcast, Common Denominator. I think, would you see, especially today, tremendous divisiveness between one person and another? I know people during COVID, they were two different viewpoints, brother and sister, and now they don't even speak to each other. I would love to see a place where people can agree to disagree. It seems to me, as a layperson, that media is materially contributing to the daily lives of divisiveness of people.
I agree.
And politicians, by the way.
I do want to be specific, though, if you will. I do want to be specific because, once again, I think local news is doing a better job and actively, from what I see, trying to improve. Right. I think a lot of what we're talking about, too, is left or right-leaning radio. I think the 24-hour cable news networks I agree with you, they are contributing to that. And that goes back to the point before where what the business models are. Remember that when Trump was in office, there were a lot of articles about how the other conservative news networks wanted to out-Fox Fox. They wanted to move farther right. Or they wanted to be more nationalistic than Fox. And those other news networks were starting to take ratings away from Fox because that's where they saw what? The ratings. That's where they saw the money. Right. So it really, the business, I can't emphasize enough how much the business does influence what happens. And that's why one of the first things we do as viewers, we need to get rid of our utopian ideals of what journalism is or what the news media is. We need to know what the difference is between commentary, journalism, and just news of the day storytelling. These are all separate things. And I think the public just bunches them up and thinks that there's, Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson are different than your local ABC, CBS news anchor. And they're totally different creatures.
And if you take, I think, 93% of communication is tone and body language. And if you just look at the way, whether it's Rachel or Tucker, the way they communicate and they express themselves, if you just pay attention to it, forget about the words, that there's some form of, of a little bit of a game of some sort. It seems, that they're trying to influence, if you want to call it that, influence their point. The greatest lecture for me, which was a tremendous framework for me, that I went to, and it doesn't just apply to the media, but this fellow, he had a Yale and he went to Stanford, tremendous degrees, and he said this line. He's like, spend your life unlearning everything you've ever learned, meaning question things in a real way and have the courage to do that, right? And that applies to the media and many things upon many things are business. And you peel back the layer. And I always used to love that example in the Wizard of Oz. Everyone's afraid, oh my God, the wizard, and then they peel back the curtain, and it's just a guy.
And I love it. I love that.
Yeah.
And it's why also I pray, and I always discuss with my friends who aren't in the news media, to not generalize the news media, to know the differences, and to know that your field reporters and a field producer, it's a totally different person than perhaps someone making an executive call in a C-suite office somewhere in New York. It's just totally different. And I hear it from my news colleagues that, they're frustrated.
Right.
There's a lot of frustration out there of what they have to go cover. They still cover it fairly, but they're sitting there and going, why do I have to go cover X story when there's a huge city council meeting that's going to decide whether or not there's a redistricting in a city? They have to tell that story in a way that's interesting, and that's a tough story to tell. It's easier to tell the story about the house fire where nobody got hurt, and that has more of that light for the lightning bugs.
So I got to ask you this. What would you say, in all the years of journalism, what would you say was the most interesting story you've covered?
The most interesting story I covered? Oh boy, there's a lot of them. I'll tell you the one that strikes me the most is I was working, this is my second on-air job. I was working at an NBC affiliate in Jackson, Mississippi. And we had gotten a tip that there was a guy who was selling burial insurance to families around the state. And we got a call from one family who had lost a loved one. And when they called to collect on the insurance to have the burial, to have this ceremony at this tough time, the guy disappeared with their money. So we tracked this guy down. We found him. We drove around the state. By the way, credit to management for allowing me to do that work, the legwork to try to find this guy, by the way.
Yeah.
We tracked him down, and I got out of the car, and with a camera and a microphone, me and my photographer, we went up to him and we challenged him. Where have you been? Are you stealing these people's money? Trying to get his side of the story. He closed up and he hid inside of his car, all on camera. And to make a long story short, the reason that's most interesting to me is because of the result. Mississippi had some of the worst burial insurance consumer protection laws in the country. After my story ran, we showed it to the Secretary of State as a follow-up to the story. And not only did that guy lose his license, but the state changed the consumer protections for burial insurance following that story. So that was the most interesting thing, because that's who we want as journalism. Right. Not only was it exciting for me because we found this guy and we held his feet to the fire, but we helped make a change for the greater good of especially people less fortunate than you and I who are being preyed upon by somebody, especially during their toughest time.
Yeah,
so I'll remember that as long as I live.
I love that. The actual seeing a compounding result based on your work is always amazing. I gotta commend you, unrelated, but I do know that, which is always mind-boggling to me, that you gave one of your kidneys to your mom.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that situation.
Well, I appreciate it. Well, my mom is my hero, so I don't ever really think it's a big deal. And I appreciate the question too, because I try to advocate this to be a living donor as much as possible. But my mom was in kidney failure, and my wife and I just had twins that were born about 9 weeks early. And while they were in the NICU, if I remember the timeline right, the person in my family that was going to donate at the last second, the doctor says she couldn't have the surgery. So we were running out of people in our very large Hispanic family who would be willing to volunteer. So without telling my mother, my brother and I went to get tested. And sure enough, I was enough of a match. And there was no question. And the hardest people to tell were my mom and then my wife. And I told them that, look, we can't raise our kids to say family first if we're not going to actually take care of our family first. And the doctors do such an amazing job before donating your kidney of doing every single test possible to say that not only can you go through the surgery, but you can live a perfectly normal life after. Wow. And the surgery was entirely successful. It was 5 years as of a few weeks ago. And I forget that I ever donated a kidney. My life has not changed one iota. And my mom we probably would have lost her 4 years ago if it wasn't for that. But when we're done with this, I've got to call her because I need help babysitting. So she's still here now. So it's a real blessing. If it sounds huge, I'm giving somebody a body part, but when I tell you from experience, it's not that big a deal. If the doctors clear you, I was out of the hospital in a day and a half. I was back to work. Right? Granted, I'm a very crazy worker. I was back to work in 10 days. I was playing basketball in a month.
I think that
you can do it and we can save lives.
Yeah, people don't realize it. So I appreciate you putting that out there because when I think of it, seems complicated, but I like that. In other words, go for the test, see that things are going to logistically work out. I think that's amazing that you help prolong your mom's life. And I want to.
She's my hero. She's my hero. So it was easy for me.
And I want to really thank you, JP. This has been really informative and great. How could people learn more about you and find out more about Brandstory Communications?
Yeah, they can just visit our website, brandstorycommunications.com. We're a public relations agency that specializes in news media relations and also video production. So my entire staff is all former news people. It's who I trust the most, both for work ethic and their ability to tell good stories. And, those are the two areas we focus on almost exclusively. And we love what we do because it's a foot in the news business still that we love so much, and then a foot out to help businesses understand the news media and have a good partnership between the two.
Well, thank you so much, JP. It's really been great. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to the Common Denominator podcast. Join us next week for another inspiring, impactful, and empowering conversation. To learn more about Moshe, head to moshepopak.com. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And we'd be grateful if you could rate, review, and subscribe to the show.